Minister in the Presidency for Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, Maite Nkoana-Mashabane, has expressed greater unease at the rate at which the rights of women as equal citizens are fast becoming eroded by the spectre of gender-based violence. Nkoana-Mashabane says the country's enduring pandemic of hate against women is threatening the rights of freedom gained under the country's young democracy. Joining us to assess the extent of the damage to women's rights as citizens is gender-based violence researcher Lisa Vetten. Lisa, good to have you again tonight here on In Focus. Now, one would generally assume that, yes, we all understand that gender-based violence is a violation of human rights, but there's been a greater erosion, I suppose, of the rights of women as citizens of the country because of the scourge of gender-based violence. Take us to the extent to which this has eroded the rights of women as equal citizens of the country.
Well, it does so in a range of ways. I mean, first, everybody has a right to be free from all forms of violence. Quite clearly, that right is not being enjoyed by women. They have the right to safety and security of the person. That right is not being enjoyed by women. They don't enjoy freedom of movement, in terms of the ability just to go out and shop, go for a walk, visit your friend, be at home. You're not enjoying that right at all. They're also not enjoying the rights to psychological integrity if you take into account the way in the traumatic and long-term effects of gender-based violence. That's also being undermined. And of course, the right to equality. I think when you go to court and you perhaps are disbelieved as not being particularly truthful, when the state doesn't put sufficient funding into addressing and making sure that the measures to address violence against women are properly funded, that undermines your right to equality. Many people understand gender-based violence as a form of discrimination because it is predominantly targeted at women. So if you do not adequately address a crime that is predominantly experienced by women, you are creating a kind of discrimination. And of course, it undermines the rights to things like access to emergency services in numerous ways.
Yeah. Now, I mean, one would argue that citizenship is defined in a gender-inclusive term, both as a status anchored in law, but also to some extent, others would say it manifests itself, for example, in companies and representation and so on and so forth. Is this a lived reality, or is it just something that we are talking about as anchored in the status of women in law? But as far as lived reality is concerned, with the scourge of crimes that is committed against women, does that translate in true representation in reality?
I think it's very uneven. I think some businesses, some workplaces do a lot better than others. If you look at government, for example, where there's a very real attempt to try to place women in senior positions, you can see greater positions of gender equity. But I think when you move into the private sector, the representation of women on boards and in senior management positions is far worse and very much lower. So I think that's the challenge in South Africa, because you're not dealing with the same situation everywhere. In many instances, you need to be able to look to see what's happening here. And you have to take into account the complexities of what is the position of women who work in the informal sector versus those who work in the formal sector. So trying to achieve gender equality on every occasion means we have to think that women are not in a homogeneous category. They are located in different ways, in different parts of the economy, in different communities. And so when we try to address their inequalities and violence, we have to take all those differences into account in order to ensure that when we try to create equality, it doesn't result in equality for some groups of women, but not for others.
Yeah. In the way that we think the distribution of resources, and as a country, are we deliberate in how we, for example, distribute our resources to promote access for women in particular, more than just saying, well, we are promoting access for everyone in the disadvantaged, but not being deliberate about how we are promoting access for women in particular?
Yes, and here I think I'm going to go back to my point about the need to understand differences between women. So, for instance, I'll give you a classic example: women with disabilities in courts. Courts are often, because it costs a lot in order to be able to, say, obtain sign language interpreters, pay for people to assist and properly assess women with intellectual disabilities and children in order to ensure they give their best evidence. to make sure they get the kind of support that will be needed, that costs a lot more. But when you look at justice budgets and, say, Department of Social Development budgets, you don't necessarily see that recognition. You might see some recognition of women, but it's not necessarily translating into recognition that some will have disabilities, and you will need to give more. So I think that's where we're not doing a very good job. We're also not doing a great job in recognizing, I think, that the minute you have a service in a rural area, it always costs more. And that's got to do with, factors of transport, petrol, etc. So when you allocate budgets, you actually need to give more money to rural areas to ensure that anybody living in those areas gets the same access to justice as somebody living in an urban area. And I think it's those kinds of nuances that are missing in terms of how we distribute resources and budgeting.
What would be the panacea in achieving the full extent of equality and gender justice?
We don't really have good information, I think. That's part of our problem in terms of trying to understand that sometimes a one-size-fits-all solution can actually create further inequality because it's not taking different women's needs into account. So I think what we need is much better information that recognizes the important differences and inequalities among women as well, and then budgeting according to that. And I think also looking at, a lot of our work tends to be very knee-jerk. There is a murder, it gets a lot of profile, everybody runs around in order to look like they're doing something and provide a solution. They do something quickly without thinking it through. And then they don't think about, well, how do we advance this across the country? What are the long-term implications of this? How do we fit this into a 5-year strategy? Now, we have the National Strategic Plan, for instance, but it's not always clear if all of that, for instance, has been adequately funded for every year and in every way. So I think a lot of our planning is not as comprehensive and as detailed as it needs to be, and that would be a good place to start.